The dark secret: reason obeys emotion, not the other way around. Hume. If you've ever believed that you're a rational person making logical decisions, if you've ever thought you were in full control of your mind, weighing facts and acting from reason, then this video is going to challenge you at the deepest possible level. Because today we're going to uncover a truth that's not just controversial, it's terrifying. One that turns our entire understanding of human nature upside down. And it all begins with a forgotten idea from the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. He said something so radical, so disruptive, that even today most people aren't ready to accept it. Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions. In other words, your logic doesn't drive your emotions drive your logic. And if that's true, then most of what we call rational thinking is just emotional justification with a fancy mask. Let's walk into that idea together. Because if we're brave enough to follow it all the way down, it will not only change how we understand ourselves, it might explain why the world is the way it is. Think about the last big decision you made. Maybe it was about a relationship. Maybe it was whether to quit your job. Maybe it was something moral, like whether to forgive someone who hurt you. You probably told yourself that you were thinking it through rationally. But you probably listed pros and cons, weighed evidence, even consulted a friend or two. But look closer. What was the emotional state behind that decision? Were you scared, hopeful, angry, guilty? Because here's the dark twist: whatever emotion was dominant in that moment shaped which facts you noticed, which reasons you elevated, and which ones you conveniently ignored. You didn't reason your way to a feeling, you felt your way to a reason.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
That's the trap. We think reason is in the driver's seat. But it's not. It's the lawyer, not the judge. It builds arguments to defend what your emotions have already decided. And this isn't just an idea, it's supported by neuroscience and psychology. Brain scans show that emotional centers light up first, milliseconds before rational centers, that our gut reacts before our mind explains. And if we're honest, we know this. That's why smart people can believe wildly different things. That's why you can argue with someone for hours, presenting facts, evidence, and airtight logic, and nothing changes. Because the real battle isn't in the mind. It's in the emotion underneath the mind. Let's take this further. Why do people fall for conspiracy theories? Why do they cling to irrational beliefs? Not because they don't understand logic, but because those beliefs give them a sense of control, or identity, or belonging. And the truth might feel threatening, so they find reasons to believe something else. And those reasons aren't chosen because they're true. They're chosen because they feel good, or feel safe, or feel righteous. So the beliefs persist, even when the facts fail. This isn't just about other people, though. It's about you. It's about me. We all do this. But we dress up our desires in the costume of reason. We tell ourselves we're being logical, when deep down we're just afraid of change, or craving validation, or avoiding pain. And that's what makes this idea so dangerous, because it means that self-deception isn't a glitch. It's a feature. It's baked into the system. And Hume saw it coming centuries ago. He looked at human behavior and realized that reason, left on its own, has no motivation. But it doesn't want anything. It just calculates. What gives it direction, what gives it purpose, is emotion. desire, fear, love, hate. Without emotion, reason is paralyzed, like a computer without a user. So when people say I'm just being rational, what they really mean is my emotions have recruited reason to make their case. This raises an uncomfortable but essential question. If reason obeys emotion, can we ever truly trust our own minds? Can we ever be sure that we're thinking clearly, or are we always just rationalizing what we already feel? And if that's the case, how do we escape the illusion of objectivity? The answer isn't to suppress emotion. That's impossible, and even if it were possible, it would be dangerous. Emotion is what makes us human. It's what gives life texture, meaning urgency. Without it, we'd be cold calculators, unable to care about anything at all. No love, no beauty, no moral outrage, no art, no passion. So the goal isn't to eliminate emotion, it's to understand it, and to recognize when it's quietly steering the ship, to pause before we call something logical and ask, what am I feeling right now? And more importantly, what do I want to be true so badly that I might be bending logic to make it fit? Because here's the thing, reason isn't the enemy. It's a tool. But like any tool, it can be used well or it can be used to build a cage around your own mind. A cage made of justifications, excuses, half-truths that feel whole because they comfort us. And when you realize that, when you truly see how your mind works, something powerful happens. You start to notice your own bias in real time. You start to catch yourself in the act of rationalizing. You start to see how your beliefs are tied to your fears and your hopes. And that awareness, that's the beginning of freedom. But the journey doesn't stop here. In fact, it's just beginning. Because if emotion really rules over reason, then we have to ask the next terrifying question: who or what is ruling over our emotions? What shapes the very feelings that shape our logic? Is it society? Memory? Trauma? Culture? Biology? And if we don't control those inputs, then who's really in control of us? The hidden puppeteer, how your emotions are programmed before you even think. If reason obeys emotion, as Hume claimed, and if our logical minds are merely servants to our passionate ones, then the next question should terrify you. Where do our emotions come from? Because if your emotions are the real drivers of your decisions, and you didn't choose those emotions consciously, then who or what is actually pulling the strings of your life? Let's go deeper. You didn't choose your childhood. You didn't choose the cultural norms you were born into. You didn't choose which faces comforted you as a baby, or which moments embedded fear deep into your nervous system. These things happened to you before you had words, before you had introspection, before you had any concept of what you even meant. And yet, those early moments became the foundation of your emotional architecture. They taught your body what to fear. They taught your heart what to desire. They taught your nervous system what safe feels like and what danger looks like. And from that moment on, your emotions were not random, but they were programmed, not by logic, not by reason, but by experience, by systems, by patterns you didn't ask for, but which now live inside you like invisible code. Take a moment and really let that in. The core of what you feel, the very sensations you trust to guide your life, were installed in you without your permission. We like to believe we're free, that we're making conscious, logical choices. But how many of those choices are just reactions to emotional triggers that were planted decades ago? How many of your preferences are really yours, and how many were shaped by the way your parents looked at you when you cried, or the stories your culture told you about success, or the fears your caregivers passed down like heirlooms? If you fear rejection, was that fear born in rational thought? Or did it come from a moment, maybe when you were 5, when someone you loved ignored you and your body learned that being vulnerable meant danger? If you crave achievement, is that because you love the pursuit of mastery? Or because, deep down, you believe that being enough is something you still have to earn? This is the puppeteer, the hidden hand that moves your emotions before your thoughts ever catch up. And because emotion directs reason, this means the real architect of your beliefs, your politics, your values, your relationships is something beneath your awareness, something ancient, something emotional, but something pre-verbal. Here's where it gets wild. Most of us live our entire lives without ever questioning the origin of our emotions. We just trust them. We think, I feel this, therefore it must be true. But emotion is not truth. Emotion is data. And often it's outdated data, like an old operating system still running in the background, long after the world has changed. You might feel shame for resting, not because rest is bad, but because someone once convinced you that your worth was tied to productivity. You might feel anxiety when trying something new, not because it's dangerous, but because your nervous system still registers uncertainty as a threat. What's terrifying is that these emotional reflexes feel so natural that we mistake them for rationality. We say, I just have a bad feeling about this, or something tells me not to trust that person. And maybe sometimes that's intuition. But more often it's programming, ancient emotional code, written by people and experiences you've long forgotten, still shaping the way you use your logic, like a tool to defend what your body already decided. So here's the question: if your emotions are shaped by unchosen experiences, and your reason obeys those emotions, are you really free? Or are you living out a script written by ghosts? This is where most people stop. They see the cage and feel hopeless. They think, if I'm not in control of my emotions, and my emotions control my thoughts, then what's the point of even trying? But that reaction, that despair, is itself an emotional response. And here's the twist: awareness changes everything. Because the moment you see the puppeteer, the strings lose power. That doesn't mean you become fully free, but it means you have leverage. You can begin to feel your feelings without obeying them. But you can start to notice your emotional reflexes without letting them run the show. That's the first step to reclaiming authorship over your mind. It's not easy. In fact, it might be the hardest work a person can do. But what's the alternative? To live your entire life on autopilot, to mistake programming for principle, to build an identity out of second-hand emotions and call it truth. No, you're here for more than that. You're here to wake up, to question, and to look in the mirror and ask, whose emotions are these really? And then, step by step, to begin rewriting the code. The emotional engine, why you can't think clearly until you master what you feel by now, the illusion of pure rationality should be cracking. We've seen how reason is not the king of the mind, but its advisor, obedient, reactive, even submissive to emotion. We've traced our emotional patterns back to childhood, to culture, to inherited trauma and forgotten moments. And in doing so, we've uncovered a terrifying truth. Most of us are driven more by unconscious emotion than conscious thought. But here's the deeper truth, and it's one that almost no one talks about. You cannot think clearly until you master what you feel. Not suppress, not ignore, not transcend, master. Because emotion is not the enemy of thought. It's the engine of it. Let's make this practical. When you're angry, your brain literally changes. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for long-term planning, ethical reasoning, and impulse control, begins to shut down. Blood flow shifts toward the amygdala, the ancient part of your brain designed for fight or flight. Your perception narrows, your memory distorts. You fixate on short-term wins, not long-term consequences. And yet, in that state, you believe you're thinking clearly. You believe your conclusions are valid. But you're not seeing reality, you're seeing a version of reality filtered through emotional distortion. This happens with fear, shame, pride, even joy. Every emotion is a lens. And if you don't know what lens you're looking through, you can't trust what you see. That's why mastering your mind isn't about becoming more logical, but it's about becoming emotionally aware, emotionally intelligent, emotionally sovereign. Because until you can recognize your emotional state in real time, your so-called thoughts are just passengers in a car that emotion is driving. You may feel like you're in control, but you're not steering. You're reacting. This is why awareness is the first superpower. If you can pause and name what you're feeling: I'm angry, I'm scared, I'm grieving, you create space between stimulus and response. And in that space, something powerful happens: choice. You can choose not to act on the emotion, or you can choose to act consciously, knowing the emotional context. But that's what mastery looks like, not the absence of emotion, but the ability to wield it, to ride the emotional wave without letting it drown your logic. Most people never get there. They live in emotional reactivity their entire lives. They think they're choosing their beliefs, but they're actually choosing emotional comfort. They think they're reasoning, but they're rationalizing. They think they're free, but they're slaves to whatever feeling is loudest. And they wonder why their lives feel chaotic, inconsistent, or unfulfilling. It's because they're not using their emotions, they're being used by them. Let's be brutally honest. How many times have you made a decision that felt right in the moment and turned out to be a disaster? And how many of those decisions were made in a heightened emotional state? But that business deal you rushed into because you were desperate. That relationship you held onto out of fear of being alone. That argument you had because you needed to feel right more than you needed to be kind. These weren't failures of logic. They were failures of emotional mastery. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine being so emotionally grounded that even when chaos erupts around you, you stay clear. Imagine being able to feel sadness without drowning in it, and to feel anger without being consumed by it, to feel joy without becoming reckless. That's the kind of emotional maturity that leads to true clarity. And clarity is the soil where wisdom grows. But this isn't just about self-help or better decision-making. This is existential. Because if you never gain control over your emotional engine, then you never truly know yourself. You only know the stories your emotions allow you to see. You only know the version of the world that matches your current emotional state. And that's not truth. That's emotional projection. So the real question is this: how much of your reality is real, and how much is just your emotional state reflected back at you? And if you don't know the answer, how can you trust any of your conclusions? This is why Hume's insight is so terrifying and so freeing. Terrifying because it means we're not the rational beings we pretend to be. Freeing because once we accept that, we can stop pretending and start training. We can start examining our own emotional roots. We can learn to regulate, to reflect, and to feel without obeying. And in doing so, we reclaim the ability to think clearly, perhaps for the first time in our lives. The final awakening, how to rebuild your mind from the inside out. We've traveled deep into the human psyche, past the illusion of logic, beyond the programming of emotion, and into the engine room where your thoughts are crafted by feelings you didn't choose. But now we arrive at the final, most important question: what can you do about it? If reason is the servant of emotion, and emotion is shaped by forces outside your control, does that mean you're just a passenger in your own life? A puppet moved by invisible hands? Or is there a way to break free, to rebuild your mind not from the outside in, but from the inside out? The answer is yes, but not in the way most people hope. Because this isn't about flipping a mental switch or reciting affirmations until your brain magically rewires itself. This is about something far more difficult and far more powerful. It's about awakening. Not in some mystical sense, but in the most grounded, terrifying, liberating way possible. The realization that you are not your thoughts, not even your emotions, but the one who can observe them. And once you can observe them, you can begin to reshape them. Let's be clear, you cannot logic your way out of your emotional programming. You can't simply tell yourself to stop being anxious, or to stop craving validation, or to stop feeling inferior. That's like yelling at a forest fire to please go out. Emotion doesn't respond to commands. It responds to conditions. If you want to change the emotion, you have to change the environment in which that emotion arises. That means confronting the roots, asking the hard questions. Why do I really feel this way? What original wound is this reaction protecting? What belief system is this emotion trying to uphold? This process isn't clean or linear. It's messy and painful and slow, but it is the only way to liberation. You begin by noticing the patterns. But when do you get defensive? When do you shut down? When do you over-explain, over-apologize, overcompensate? Each of these reactions is a thread leading back to a deeper truth, and follow it. Sit with the discomfort long enough, and it will reveal something you weren't ready to see before. And when it does, you don't argue with it. You feel it. You let it pass through you like a wave. Only then can it begin to lose its grip. And here's the paradox. By surrendering to the feeling, you start to loosen its control over you. You stop being afraid of your anger, your sadness, your loneliness, and that fearlessness gives you leverage. You can now interact with emotion, not as a slave, but as a conscious participant. You begin to choose how to respond, not just react. And in that gap between reaction and response, your reason is reborn not as the slave of passion, but as its partner. This is what it means to rebuild your mind from the inside out. It's not about erasing emotion, it's about integrating it. You don't silence the emotional engine, you learn how to drive it. You begin to create new emotional associations through action. You show your nervous system over and over that you can speak your truth and still be safe, that you can fail and still be worthy, but that you can be alone and still be whole. Over time, your emotional defaults shift, and when they shift, your reasoning shifts with them. Not because you're forcing it, but because the foundation has changed. And this is the final awakening, that your mind is not fixed, that your emotions are not destiny, that the deepest truths about yourself are not found in logic alone, but in the space where emotion and awareness meet. The place where you stop being a prisoner of your programming and start becoming the author of your life. So let me leave you with this. What if you've been thinking your way through life when you were supposed to be feeling your way into clarity? What if your greatest wisdom doesn't come from your mind at all, but from the reconciliation between your thoughts and the emotions they've been trying to silence? That is the dark secret Hume hinted at, that reason cannot save you, but awareness might. And in the end, the path to true freedom doesn't begin with thought. It begins with the courage to feel what you've spent your whole life running from and to finally stop mistaking emotional comfort for truth. That's not just philosophy, that's transformation.